So I'll provide some background first. Really happy to be here representing Alberta in a room full of Ontarians, so smiling faces. W21C, so that's a research innovation program. It's university-based, out of the O'Brien Institute for Public Health, and it focuses on health service innovation, so essentially trying to provide evidence to enhance patient safety and quality of care. So that program supports a human factors research program. If you don't know about human factors, it's basically like physical ergonomics combined with cognitive ergonomics. So not just looking at physical limitations and capabilities, but also taking into account psychological ones. So from that sense, we either do two things medium or both things really poorly, depending on who you talk to. In my background, it's a blend of psychology and engineering, so really trying to take an understanding of human limitations and capabilities and apply that to design. So in the context of this project that I'll talk about today, that was our approach. We essentially wanted to look at how people are interacting with the patient compartment of Alberta Health Services' newest ambulance and understand how physiology and psychology influence that interaction, so ultimately we can provide design recommendations to our health authority. I have nothing to disclose, so that means you can trust me, but I'm not making any money doing this. And our principal partners for this study, so this was a really great collaboration with our health authority, with the University of Calgary, and Auto21, which was NCE for automotive research from 2001 to 2016, funded some of the research. Federal government, so you can trust them. No. So just to give you a high-level overview of the project, what we're really trying to do with this, we wanted to collaborate with multiple stakeholders. So that we're talking about stakeholders from within the health authority. So as a research group, we had great buy-in from fleet management, from learning and development, from frontline staff that contributed to the success of this project, but also drove our research questions. So as we're kind of trying to say, hey, this is what we think about ambulance design, fleet would come back to us and say, well, here are the limitations that we're working with from a systems perspective. We wanted to engage AHS staff in participatory design. And so for some additional context, AHS is basically standardizing their fleet throughout the province. I'll talk about that in more detail. But they were receiving some negative feedback from providers. And so this was a really important engagement opportunity to essentially say, hey, we want to hear your opinions. We also want to look at that from an evidence-based design perspective. So that's where the university came in. Doug mentioned earlier, a lot of reports sit on shelves and don't go anywhere. So one of our primary objectives was actually to provide specific recommendations for the health authority that they could act on from a purchasing perspective or a staffing perspective. And then finally, from a broader kind of goal, these results, they're not tucked away for AHS. We're in the KT phase right now, so technical report to our health authority, academic publications, conference venues like this. And so everything I'm going to talk today in broad strokes, I can talk about more detail or share that information with anyone who's interested. So this is my home. That's Alberta. Alberta is a really interesting province to do ambulance research in. So they have a provincial health authority. They can purchase they have 550 ambulances that serve an area of around 660,000 square kilometers, population of about 4 million. And on this graph, the two dots there, they have about 70% of the population concentrated in 10% of the square area, so right around the Calgary and Edmonton area there. So if you think about it from a design perspective and you're trying to standardize, are there differences? Essentially, you have a heterogeneous population. So the providers that are working in your metropolitan areas might want a different ambulance than the providers working in Grand Prairie. The difference in population density goes from 100 people per square kilometer down to 8 or 5, I think, in Grand Prairie. So that was kind of how we approached this, to say, well, one of our primary questions is, can you standardize? And if you are going to standardize, what evidence should you use to inform that design? The interesting thing about the study is we actually looked at providers across the province. And so thinking about, we started in the south there, we went all the way up north and engaged participants. They came into this research study and they gave us their opinions, but we were also watching the behavior. So one of the things that I really want to stress today that differentiates what I'll talk about with some of the previous design in ambulance is a behavioral approach. So what I mean by that, I'll talk a bit about methods. Alberta Health Services donated an ambulance for the duration of the study. For about 6 months, we took their most recent ambulance at the time, this was 2.5, 3 years ago, and standardized the care delivery scenario on the back of it. So we had a simulated patient that you see in the middle there. We had providers deliver care to that patient. The scenario stayed the same every time. We had about 100 EMS providers from the south to the north of the province come into the back of the ambulance, and we observed everything they were doing. So just massive data capture rate. So we had ceiling-mounted cameras, we had them wear eye trackers, we audio record them. To give you a sense of what that looks like, I'm going to hope this video works, which I have to pull over because it's on the web. I think it's coming. There we go. Okay. So this is Ian McEwen. He's one of the guys from L&D. I mentioned that engaging them was key for the study. And I'm going to talk over this video. You don't need to hear the audio, but to give you a sense of the data that we're capturing, essentially we're driving the ambulance around. It actually is motionary, so we set up a test track at each test site, drove the same loop, so we could go from a stationary ambulance to a motionary or transporting one. And we record everything that the providers are doing. So they go from basic life support, the patient presents, they're having an allergic reaction that progresses to anaphylactic reaction and requires advanced care life support. We're looking at eye tracking behavior, so how do they search for equipment? So this is just, these are actually public education officers, so these aren't real participants, so we have this video on YouTube if you want to see it in more detail. And what we're trying to just get an understanding of is how do people actually behave? And this is a different approach than you could get from a ride-along in the sense that every observation we have is the same scenario. So anaphylaxis, the medical control protocol for that is relatively standardized, and unless, medics are significantly deviating from that, the behaviors we see, the equipment they access is relatively the same. So the benefit of this is we can aggregate this massive data set for behavioral analysis. The crux of this is, of course, the design conflict, right? So you've got paramedic safety and you've got care delivery. And those are your two things that we're essentially looking at as the key trade-off in here. And this is talking head Jeff Carrot, so that's, he's the academic lead for this project. And he's in Calgary right now, enjoying the nice weather. So I won't talk too much more about this, but this is just to give you a flavor of kind of, okay, when we say we're doing a behavioral study, what we're trying to do is standardize the behaviors that we're going to observe, get a broad swath of both basic life support, so your kind of high occurrence but low acuity scenarios, all the way up to advanced care life support. Then we want to take that data and say something meaningful about it that will inform design. So we'll close this off now. And like I said, if you are interested in that in more detail, I can talk about it, but really, let's see if we can do this. I should have probably practiced this before I tried to figure out how to do it. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Perfect. And okay, back on track. So we have all this data. What are we going to do with it? We want to analyze it. And so essentially you've got about each of these scenarios that I'm talking about averages about half an hour. We have paramedics working in pairs or triplets in the back of the patient compartment. We've got 6 video streams. We've got audio. We basically want to synchronize all that data and come up with some standardized way to describe the interactions between the paramedics and their environment, the working environment. So this is the Human Factors Lab at the W2NC, the University of Calgary. Synchronize all that data and then feed it into specialized software for behavioral analysis. So this is just a screen cap of that software, but what we're really doing is developing operational definitions for any behavior we think relates to care delivery or provider safety, and literally anything. So this is a massive undertaking. So it took 2 RAs, probably about 4 months of full-time coding to go through this data set. In terms of the level of detail for things that we might be interested in, they coded 1,600 pieces of garbage, specifically where they ended up in the ambulance, whether it was disposed of in a bin or on the patient, or sharp, whether it was capped, not capped when it was disposed of. All the way up to things like how often are they wearing their seatbelt. The really cool thing about this, and one of the benefits I think that I want to speak to, is that this data set essentially exists for us to now mine. And so when we have people, okay, well, does anything about the environment change the way that people adopt safety behaviors like wearing their seatbelt? We can actually look back at this and say, okay, what was seatbelt usage like when the ambulance was stationary versus when it was in motion? If the health authority comes to us now and this actually happened, they said, we want to know how often someone is manipulating the 3-point seat adjustment to rotate the seat facing forward. That's an easy question to go back to this data set and say, hey, on average, you're getting about 4 providers out of 30 that actually touch the seat during care. The rest of them just sit facing perpendicular to the direction of travel unbelted for about 98% of the time the ambulance is in motion. And that data is relatively generalizable because of the way we set up the study design. So I really want to impress upon you that you could care about this. You should. I think it's amazing. So what does that data actually look like when we go to inform design? So this is just a visualization of what we're doing. And here you basically have, we divided the workspace that paramedics might use into these 5 sections. So you've got the counters in the green, their chair or the lap in blue, the floor in yellow, the patient in red, and the stretcher in gray. So these are the work surfaces that we observe providers using. The definition for that work surface is that they're actually actively using it. So it's not just storage, but they might be doing medication preparation on this. They might be getting ready to bag the patient, and so they're actually resting the equipment on them while they prepare the patient for that. And what this is telling you is that about an equal proportion of the time that they use in a designed workspace in the back of the ambulance, they're also using the patient as a work surface, and they're also using the floor as a work surface. And so when we go to try to inform design with this, what we're really saying is you have a design gap. Your work surfaces are underutilized relative to these other surfaces. And what are the characteristics of the work surfaces that they are using? They're proximal to them when they need to use them. They're big, so you think about how big the patient is or how big the floor is, and really what they need is surface area. And so our recommendations in this sense are, hey, make sure that your work surfaces are proximal to the right-hand side of the provider and make them bigger. And you'll see actually that green work surface next to the curbside chair in this case is the smallest work surface they have, and it's underutilized. And we did this for a lot of other design features, and if you have questions, I can go into detail about that. So it's really intensive, and so one of the questions that we get is it worth it? We can just ask people their opinions, and you have self-report or expert opinion driving design. That's useful to have as well. And it is, and what we're looking at this is just, it's not the be-all, end-all of ambulance research. It's another tool to understand how providers use the back of the ambulance, and it's there to supplement the design process. So in addition to this, we sent out a survey to about 700 providers across the province, or 700 providers responded out of everyone that saw it. And we asked a bunch of questions. This is a Likert scale, so we just said, hey, do you like the new ambulance relative to previous ones you've worked in? And on the y-axis here, you have proportion of responses, and the clusters here go from strongly disagree, so they essentially don't like the new ambulance, to strongly agree they like the new ambulance. And one of the things you'll see here is there's a really big difference in the center, or I guess going from left to right. You've got the south zone, rural, Calgary, which is metropolitan, central zone, which is rural, Edmonton zone, which is metropolitan, and the north zone, which is rural. If you can see it from back there, essentially you're seeing a significant difference in the way that the metropolitan services respond to the new ambulance versus the rural ones. From a design perspective, you're going to standardize, and half your population hates the new design and the other half loves it. How do you reconcile that? And the self-report data doesn't go into enough detail to solve that challenge. So we saw this with a lot of the self-report data that we collected. The second piece I thought was really interesting. We asked people to report the strengths and weaknesses of the new design. So in this case, you're seeing the top 6 strengths out of 34 and the top 6 weaknesses out of 30. And we just use a preference ranking algorithm to separate first, second, and third rankings. 4 of the top strengths are also 4 of the top weaknesses. So if I'm making a design decision, what do I do with that? Some people think there's not enough room. Some people think there is enough room. Some people hate the new seats. Some people love the new seats. Some think the suspension got worse. Some think it got better. Interestingly enough, the guys in the rural zone actually think the suspension got better, even though their roads are much worse. So what we were trying to go back to the health authority to say is, hey, we understand that you're getting a lot of feedback from providers. We're getting the same feedback. Sometimes it's contradictory. Sometimes it's not informed enough to actually leverage a decision. So there's a difference between a complaint and a recommendation. And we're trying to use that behavioral data to balance these things. And so when we look at, for example, enough room, what does enough room mean? We can look at seated reach envelopes. So how much room do you actually need to be able to reach equipment that's next to you? What are the clearances you need to navigate around the stretcher? One of the interesting findings from this was about 4 times in 30 minutes, paramedics would have to climb over cabling and tubing in the back of the ambulance during advanced care life support activities. We also noticed that they don't maintain 3 points of contact while they do that, so they're exposing themselves to increased risk. So you can actually leverage it to say, okay, not enough room means a lot of different things, but the behaviors show you that something really specific that you can change in terms of integrating cabling and tubing will decrease the risk in the back of the ambulance providers when they're motionary or moving. And you can also look at some of the anthropometric data we collected and say, hey, what's your 95th percentile waist clearance? That's going to be huge when it comes to navigating around the stretcher between the cabinetry and the stretcher. And that's what actually drives people's satisfaction with workspace is their own physical dimensions in terms of physical space. So I kind of am leading into this, but essentially the recommendations we had for the health authority can be broken down into these sections here. Physical dimensions, how big should the ambulance be? One of my favorite things about working with the health authority, and this came up, and I should say that this is coming from my perspective as a guy out of the university. HS was a great partner, but I don't know if they agree with us or not. We basically said you should accommodate your 95th percentile male, in terms of height of the patient compartment, so he could stand without craning his neck. The majority of your population will be able to do that. And they said to us, well, we have ambulance bays throughout the province, right, that don't have clearances to let those ambulances into the bay if we make them any taller. So there's essentially a system constraint that we knew nothing about without talking to the health authority, that if we make the ambulances bigger, all of a sudden the paramedics working in these rural regions wouldn't be able to park their ambulances inside. So what do you do about that? Well, you can either make bigger ambulance bays in rural regions or just keep having people hunched over. So things like that came up. Seating, I'll say something controversial just so we get some questions. I think they should go back to bench seating. If you want to know why, I'm happy to talk about that. Equipment access and workspace, we coded things like how often they access equipment, where do they access equipment from, should they be working out of bags or cabinetry? Again, we have a system where they do both. Are you doing both things medium, or can you do one thing really well? Cabling and tubing, as we've covered. Waste disposal was really interesting. We actually have waste topography diagrams that the REs call garbage maps. And we're looking at essentially where does garbage end up and why? And it ends up right next to people because that's where they are. So essentially, can we design better waste disposal systems? And then provider suggestions. So again, we've got hundreds of recommendations from providers, and we just try to put those in context for the behavioral data we capture to say, hey, if they disagree about something, I mean, it's easy when everyone's unanimous and they say, yeah, we need cabinetry, so when we access equipment from the outside of the ambulance, we're not standing in gas fumes. Everyone agrees, that's fine. But when people disagree on whether they want to work out of bags or whether they want to work out of the cabinets, it's great to have that behavioral data to go back to. We can query that and actually say, well, your time to access equipment is significantly faster if they work out of a bag than if they work out of the cabinets. Or looking at things like expertise. New medics want to work out of bags, old medics want to work out of cabinets. We can look at that too and actually couch those recommendations in a change management process. So I mentioned this already. The biggest challenges for ambulance design, you guys all know this already. Interaction to design features. So as we increase workspaces, clearances around the patient decrease. How do you solve those things? And I think that just requires creative solutions. All of the design challenges are just opportunities for innovation in the way we build spaces. So I think there's tremendous opportunity here to take some of those design conflicts and say, yeah, let's work with industry partners, with universities, with the health authorities to actually design something better. One of our biggest concerns was the concept of designing for actual use versus intended use. And so what we see in this case is that the health authority has an obligation to provide the safest working environment possible, and that's a serious responsibility. What happens when you know that 98% of the time those safety features are underutilized? And I'm using 98% because we saw that people use seatbelts about 2% of the total time. And so we should be evaluating these ambulances both as we want them to be used and as they're actually being used to get a true understanding of the risk that providers face in the back of the patient compartment. And if you don't do that, you've essentially designed a system that isn't as safe as you might think it is. And then one of the crux, essentially for a health region as large as Alberta Health Services, designing for a really heterogeneous population is a huge challenge. And the big hanging question here is, can you standardize and should you standardize? And that's an ongoing discussion that we're having with the health authority. So that's a really quick presentation. I've gone, huge team to support this. So these are some of the chief players. But I'm happy to field questions when the time comes. Thank you.